Good evening, everyone. My name is Lori Lynn Turner. I'm the Associate Director of the New School Writing Program. And I'm very happy to be here with our friends at Cave Canem this evening. I always learn real things about writing and thinking and living and loving at Cave Canem Poets on Crafts Talks. And I welcome you to do the same this evening. So to get the evening started, I would like to invite Nicole Seeley, Programs Director of Cave Canem Foundation, to come up to the podium and introduce tonight's fabulous poets. Nicole?
Good evening, everyone. As you may already know, Cave Canem is a national organization dedicated to cultivating the artistic and professional growth of African American poets. Since 1996, Cave Canem has been a home for Black poetry across the country. Please check out our back table where you can sign up to be on our mailing list and buy books. You can also learn about us, what we're up to, and ways to support by visiting our website, cavecanempoets.org. I'd like to thank our generous hosts, the New School, especially Lori Lynn Turner, who we thoroughly enjoy working with. Thanks also to our funders, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and the Giles Whiting Foundation. And of course, all of you for coming out tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Aracelis Girmay and Fady Joudah. Aracelis is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Teeth and Kingdom Animalia, winner of the Isabella Gardner Poetry Award. She is an assistant professor of poetry at Hampshire College and on the faculty of Drew University's low-res MFA program. She has received grants and fellowships from the NEA, the Jerome Foundation, the Watson Foundation, and of course, Cave Canem Foundation. Fady Joudah is a Palestinian American physician of internal medicine, the author of 3 poetry collections and 3 volumes of poetry in translation. His first book of poetry, The Earth in the Attic, won the Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize in 2007. Alight and Textu, his second and third poetry collections, respectively, followed in 2013 from Copper Canyon. Textu is an ebook-long sequence composed on a cell phone, wherein each poem or stanza is exactly 160 characters long, using character count as poetic meter. And just to plug, Joudah will be facilitating a master class at Cave Canem's headquarters in Brooklyn tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m., using his innovative collection Textu as an illustration and jumping off point to explore experimental poetry. Space is limited, but available. Girmay and Joudah will each read selections from their individual collections. Following their readings, Tonya M. Foster, author of Swarm of Bees in High Court and recipient of a Ford Foundation Fellowship, will moderate a conversation between the pair. Please help me welcome Aracelis, Fady, and Tonya.
Thank you, Nicole, for your introduction and for all the work in bringing us here. Allison, Cave Canem, New School. Thank you all for being here and for all the things you did to be here tonight. Just making a note of my time. I'm going to read a couple poems. You can hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? I'm going to read a couple poems from a new cycle, newish cycle of poems that I've been working on. And then I'm going to try something new, interrupting that cycle with an older poem and then going back to a newer one. I just wanted to start with this quote. It is estimated that over 20,000 people have died at sea making the journey from North Africa to Europe in the past 2 decades. That number keeps rising week by week. On October 3rd, 2013, it is estimated that 300 people died at sea off the coast of Lampedusa, which is a small Italian island. The phenomenon of people traveling on small boats across the Mediterranean to Europe is age-old and involves issues of asylum as well as migration. Those on board the boat that sank off Lampedusa were nearly all Eritrean and many are likely to have been in need of international protection, end quote, Adrian Edwards, UN Refugee Agency. This cycle, it feels important to say that the nationality of the people who are drowning is not all that important to me. But I'm focusing on Eritrea because it's a story I feel closer to and a history that I know better. My father's from Eritrea, so that feels important to say. This first poem addresses the dead. Beloveds, beneath the surface of your last place, the tiny, oblivious fishes form wreaths above the sea grasses and their long reach. Some mornings in my own city far away, I run to greet you come to me as sea and carry myself out into your long, dark time like a child meeting its older cousins. I touch your teeth and give you the single word of my body. I am a woman again at the side of Abwe Haile's bed, Abwe who is 96. He is brushing my acacia hair. He is holding my arm. He says, moving his hand to mean all around us, that this is my home. He means Adisogdo, but he also means the world. Though I think in America that I am there and he is here, that we are different or far, really we are each other. My bones are your bones, he says. His teeth are my teeth, and my smiling is his smiling. He holds my arm tight until it is a stone, a bone. He smooths my hair with force. I am a horse. The long, dark skin of the water, the talking Abwe of the water, the brushing back my acacia hair, washing my face. When we are done, I cross the sea back into air and return to the traffic of the streets I know. I am marked by the dead, your sea letters of salt and weeping. Now I am ready to lay myself down on the earth, to listen to the instructions for how to talk of love and land, to sing of place in the horrible years, and to fill my language like the stars do with the light, anyway, of a future tense. This is in the voice of one of the characters, Luam, to the dead. And Luam is in Italy. The news announces your last place, a picture of rocks and sand. Having slipped through the seam of one realm into another, through into the lost, where hours no longer touch you, we wait and wait. A figure catches in the street, your color, your height, the rareness of both in this town. But you are the nothing now, except what history carries in its dog teeth. Life, my luxury, my room alone at the hill's green foot, my view of racket and deer. At night, I run the shower to warm me. The water, it comes suddenly, cousin, my hand through you. This is a note, and then there's also a line in this poem after a line by Gwendolyn Brooks. Note, the obelisk of Axum was erected in the 4th century AD and was probably used to mark the site of an underground burial chamber. In 1937, it was shipped as war booty to Italy, where it was erected in Rome. It was not returned until 2005. Today, there are 8 ancient Egyptian obelisks still standing in Rome. To be near sea is to gleam with dream. Though to cross means loss, but behold the gold and strolling, nobody's cajoling, and the freeze off running from lead and gunnings to the bleak audition, and then transmission over sea. They flee and flee and flee from home toward Rome in pieces on ships like the obelisks, then reaching, not reaching, then coffled into coffins, the leadened news, the citizen dead, a crime to live, a crime to leave, you left, all of us visiting the world, some counted as more, some counted as less. Luam in the sea to the survivors. Boat by boat, you inch the tightrope thinly together, every now and then stopping for your eyes to follow into dark space the brother who would not last. The galaxy does not blink, for this sadness churns on, though you throw your faces down after, over the relatives, now little bones and sand. Remember to be what the Berbera made you, lit with red life, the holler of survivor's blood. Remember your names from when we were green, when history was little. And I just wanted to say, Berbera is this red pepper that's ground with other spices, and it's bright, bright red, and when you cook it, often with butter or oil, it gets like blackish red. The Luams. So there are several Luams who are all over. One of them is taken after Pushkin's great-grandfather is said to have been kidnapped from somewhere in Africa, and Eritrea is one of the places that claims him. And Pushkin, there was recently a statue erected in the capital of Pushkin. But his great-great-grandfather was known as Peter the Great's Negro. And he was given to Peter the Great, who apparently loved him very much. And that's a whole other long story. But when he it's said that this great-great-grandfather had a sister who, in some stories, was also kidnapped, but was brutalized and died at sea. And in other stories, she wasn't kidnapped, but she followed her brother and tried to follow him, but drowned in the sea trying to follow the boat. So there are several stories, and this is in the story of the voice of that Luam, but also other Luams who are living now. In ancient Egyptian mythology, Isis, sister wife of Osiris, goes out looking for her beloved's body, which has been scattered in pieces all over the earth by his jealous brother. I am thinking of this story as a version of the story of Luam and Abram, her brother, but also as a story of dismemberment, migration, diaspora. For this reason, the voice of the poem is plural, to accommodate the voices of the different Luams in this cycle. The kite in stanza 2 refers to the bird known for its scavenging for parts and food, and its associations with funerals and Isis. First, our footsteps, this way, that, up the mountain, then down, in the river, then out, then my wings, my sister body, a red kite's. We find you scattered there and here and there, your body a fluttering procession of ants carrying fruit. In the sea, your body in the boat of ours, your body in the road, on the news, there and here and there. We find you then, and with our thread and letters sew you back neatly, piece by piece. How we, our broken book, at night we dream as we assemble you. We too assemble our rage, its hands and mouth, though we must choose in the end which, the poem of healing or the poem of poisons. The sun is shining now against our forehead. We will stay this shape if it means you will live, not as you did before, but in the trees, the silt of the river, unkillable as the hush of air traveling through Adezufan's corn. This is a leap, a giant leap, into 1991 and Boyz II Men. Some of you might remember the countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7. So this is called Coolie High, Fifth Estrangement. I guess it's a funny thing, really, how I can't hear Boyz II Men, even the 90s bedroom countdown and the color blue of Michael McCrary's Injection Fellas, without wanting to cry, a real cry. Look, I've slipped into the surprise and trapdoor of my own heartache just like that. The Coolie High harmony on repeat in the tape deck as my mom and I drove up to boarding school my first year, 1991. And though I've tried, I can't stop being touched by the borrowed car, my mother's hands, the steering wheel, a kind of clock we moved with toward the finish line. We rode, a slow unfurling of ourselves across 120 miles despite history, despite warnings of colored kids washed by books or kerosene and lie in the white yards of schools far from their fathers and the stars. And still, hundreds of us tumbling out of our houses to be half raised. The ghosts of children from the Paris Indian School did come down from the hills all the way from Riverside to watch the odd quiet of our take leavings. Their hairs thick with cactus and grave dirt, the prickly pears of their mouths warning, some parts of you will die there. I can still see it all so clearly now. The school gate is a carving knife. This is the future Mom chooses for me, and she drives me to my dormitory room, different from the one I woke in, beside my cousin and small sister, brother sleeping in the trundle. I have been thrown into new orbit. This is an old story. Distance in the name of opportunity, the complicated sacrifice, and so on. But I could have stayed home for so long with my people, helped around the house, gotten a job. In Chicago, my mother's hometown, the death toll climbs like a serpent up the red graph. We are 2,000 miles away, but the deaths of black kids everywhere are at her neck. So this is what she chooses for me. I am not gifted, no more than Angel or Sargent or Lenara, almost anybody, really, but know how to read and to obey the rules of tests. And the academic officer says hope and promise to my mother, whose own mother would not choose my mother, who turns her back, and suddenly the car with her hands is leaving. I think, who will be my parent now, as the orange trees dot the coming darkness with their small fires, and not far the sadness of oaks and dry brush. Still, the car with her hands leaving. Please stay with me as I replay the last touch. My face buried in her hair and neck. How I am quiet and let her say, this is the best thing, though I disbelieve it even now. She was my mother after all, and president of nothing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a teenage daughter, and that last poem messed me up. It's hard. So I'm just going to read a poem from, the opening poem from my first book, and then I'll read from Alight. So the first book, the first poem is called Atlas, and it was based on my days that I spent with Doctors Without Borders in Darfur.
Can you speak a little louder?
Sure. The end of the road is a beautiful mirage. White jeeps with mottos, white and blue tarps where the dust gnaws at your nostrils like a locust cloud or a helicopter thrashing the earth, wheat grains peppering the sky. For now, let me tell you a fable. Why the road is lunar goes back to the days when strangers sealed a bid from the despot to build the only path that courses through the desert of the people. The tyrant secretly sent his men to mix hand grenades with asphalt and gravel, then hid the button that would detonate the road. These are villages and these are trees 1,000 years old, or the souls of trees, their high branches axed and dangled like lynched men flanking the wadis, closer now to a camel's neck and paradoxical chew. And the villages, children packed in a hut, then burned or hung on bayonets, truck tires anchoring acacia limbs as checkpoints, and only animals return. The monkeys dash to the road's edge and back into the alleyways, and by a doorstep a hawk dives and snatches a serpent. Your eyes twitch in saccades and staccatos. This blue-crested hoopoe is whizzing ahead of us from bow to bow, the hummingbird wings like fighter jets refueling in midair. If you believe the hoopoe is good omen, the driver says, then you're one of us. And then I came back from Doctors Without Borders and got married and became a father. So much for that. So here's a poem called Mimesis. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles. For 2 weeks, she waited until it left of its own accord. If you tear down the web, I said, it will simply know this isn't a place to call home and you'd get to go biking. She said, that's how others become refugees, isn't it? Schoolgirl. The love rose in my heart has wilted. The love bug, the news on the transistor, a nice man with a ponytail says, it's understandable if you wanted to leave here for there. They were burying the evidence structurally. Boys in prison cells, and outside the kids play stretcher. One of them was dying between my hands. You think commands, injections, things to make the time pass as hope or action. She used to chase love bugs after school to make them alight on her. She wanted not to have walked with naked men chained to a tank. In the houses she entered, a lemon, an olive, an apricot. And then I had a son, and for for those of you who have had children or have taken care of newborns as parents or caregivers, aunts or uncles or so forth, I don't know, it's a strange moment when there's always a moment you wake up in the middle of the night just making sure that the baby is breathing, And so this poem is called Sleep. For years, I have known her an old woman, a nurse's aide. She always says good morning, and not until my son was born did she share this with me. In her wallet, 2 photos, one of a 10-pound baby, her firstborn, who shot himself accidentally playing with a gun when he was 12. In Cyprus, the Trojan side, at a cafe, an old woman approached me, a teenager then, and said I looked like her dead son. I have a familiar face, and despite what my mother or sister say, these dreams aren't for construal. I leap from my sleep to visceral sounds my newborn makes in his sleep. I wrap his torso in the frond of my palm and watch my father's breathlessness, then his gasp. A woman wrote over and over in precise short poems the 5 stages of grief. It began a few mornings after she walked in on her son dead in his sleep. I am older now. I bear the news of a son's death to his mother. He was the weaker of the twins, I say. It wasn't anything you did or didn't do. What was it then, she asks, and I can only answer her in my sleep. Okay. And then there is this. There are these moments where, they're sweet moments, really, but they're somehow strangely, psychotically absurd. Like when you freak out that, you have your newborn in the back seat, and then a mosquito gets in the car, and so this poem is called Decadence. And I live in Houston, for those of you who need to know. August, air-conditioned swamp city. A mosquito made itself manifest after we'd shut the doors, got on our way, the baby fastened in his rear-facing seat. It wasn't long before we parked at the shoulder of the road and let the ass-huggers behind us pass. We were free to swipe at the lone mosquito, hemi-ballistic, just as our son would at things and nothings, if such a thing exists. Or perhaps we mimicked Korea, pronounced like the state so frequently mentioned, though it comes with options, as in, I once saved a girl from Korea, or I once got a boy out of Korea, which takes no more than a few shots. But there would be no moving on unless the mosquito was dead, the cabin completely sealed. We wanted a rectangular mortality, an impartial falling at line's end. Okay, and there is and this poem, which I also like, called Twice a River. Well, it's also, again, when I had my son, began to think of, having grown up as in a Palestinian household. And it's an interesting question about identity. Aracelis says, my father is Eritrean, and I would say my father is Palestinian, but really, you start thinking at which point does one say, I am a Palestinian, and I am, but is there a problem with that? Not the Palestinian part, but the non-American part, or the hyphenation of things, or the, and it's very interesting to think of those emotions with your children before they begin to speak, and what you start thinking of what will you say to them, because my experience is very different than, say, my parents or my grandparents. Drastically removed from the idea of geography as we know it in America, perhaps. But obviously, not a brand new idea. Twice a River. After studying our faces for months, my son knows to beam is the thing to do. He'll spend years deciphering love, the injustice or the illusion of it. Having been brought into this world, volition is an afterthought. What will I tell him about land and language and burial places my father doesn't speak of? Perhaps my mother knows. In the movie, the dispossessed cannot return even when they're dead. The journalist felt rebuke for not having thought it mattered or for having thought it mattered too much. Will I tell my son all nations arise after mass murder, that I don't know any national anthem by heart, can't sing, take me out to the ball game? I should turn to flowers and clouds instead, though this has already been said well. It is night when he gazes into his mother's eyes at bath time. Qais and Layla, she announces after a long day's work. He giggles with his shoulders, not knowing he's installing a web in his amygdala or whichever places science thinks love dwells. Even love is a place? O son, love no country and hate none. And remember crimes sometimes immortalize their victims, other times the victimizer. Remember how you used to gaze at the trampoline leaves on their branches? Don't believe the sound of the sea in a seashell. Believe the sea, the endless trope, and don't say much about another's language. Learn to love it while observing silence for the dead and the living in it. So I want to read this poem called the Bedouin poem. It's a very offensive term. I think everybody knows that now. It's almost comical that everybody knows that now. To call a Muslim a Mohammedan. And the reason that nobody uses it anymore, because it's a slur to just say someone is Islamic or something. You don't need to go to any other expressions. So I wrote this poem about the Bedouin poem, so it's just called the Bedouin poem. And it has a quote from Rotka, "The moon, a pure Islamic shape, looked down." The Bedouin poem. A fish in the tank, you say, is better than 10 at sea, but it simply ate all the other fishes in the tank, grew huge and ugly, and when looked up on the net, it turned out edible, a delicacy, in fact, in some true marine community. The Bedouin man put on a pair of flowery kitchen sink gloves. His wife and her children cheered his fearful hands. He's a stepdad. The fish plopped out to hardwood floor sound effect on a Texas farm, or maybe it was carpet. Grilled and a memory. All who were in the room wolfed it, except the daughter who was startled out of sleep unto the scene, and the grandmother who, like a Mohammedan, still wears her thick lavender mourning and touring veil. That's a quote from a Robert Lowell poem. Later, the wife and children wanted a dog. To convince the Bedouin, they told him the puppy of litter and giveaways they had found was instead one abandoned in a cemetery on burial day, where an old bereft woman was kneeling in her Sunday black dress and touching the ground with her forehead like a Mohammedan. Now, in love, the Bedouin naps on the floor with the puppy by his armpit. In his mother's house, there was room for anyone at the Last Supper, such as time, a hound, or a pit bull, what names may bring. The dog never barks at a soul in town whom the dead mother knew, loved or didn't. And I will end with my ebook. So they're a very short poem, and they're poems, and they read in sort of a accretion. So I'll just maybe finish with a couple. Immune. My heart isn't another's. Love is no transplant. It can be, or when I'm dead, I will give you my eyes and also my liver. You must suppress their memory of me. Okay.
Thank you, Aracelis and Fady, for really wonderful readings. And it's remarkable how the work, in some ways, is in conversation across incredible distances of experience. And it's beautiful, this kind of trafficking in both love and loss. I thought I would start, I had this whole question about form that I thought I'd start with, but then you mentioned Pushkin. And so, okay. So can you talk a bit about inspiration? Pushkin said, inspiration will not be sought, it must itself find the poet. So what happens if it finds you? And where does inspiration come from? Where does the poem come from?
You mentioned Pushkin first. So.
I'll just move back. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have no idea. But I do know that it's important to me to pay attention to what moves me and to give myself time to be out walking, to be quiet enough to kind of hear what is moving me. And sometimes that's a real struggle. Mm-hmm. And I also know, so there's the mystery and the bewilderment of it all. And there's the fact of coming to a page and having a couple of words, or, cutting cucumbers and thinking, oh God, this line comes to you, right? Which we know, and then going and writing it down and visiting it again. And the mystery of kind of pushing against words and thoughts and how that happens. It feels really mysterious, but I also know that it's important, it's always been important to me to be reading and to visit the writers who, to be reading new work, work that's new to me, but also the writers who move me. Like I think of Toni Morrison, coming to her in high school and just being so blown away and struck by her language and those lush sentences and then those spare sentences. And Yusef Komanyaka, similarly, every time I read his poems, I feel like I'm returned to something that is, the blood of my own language, which is very different from his. But there's some kind of daring and what's the word? Something so idiosyncratic and his own that somehow encourages me to speak my language. So I don't know, and also reading, going to look at photographs, listening to stories, time.
Yeah, I agree about the I don't know part, because I think that we all receive inspiration in anything. Say a woodsmith receives inspiration, and a mechanic receives inspiration to solve a problem. And so we don't really know how these things work. And I think that when we speak of the arts, I hear it as we're speaking more of the specificity of the medium used to employ the inspiration, which is in this case words and sounds, and for a painter maybe it's shapes and color in different ways than other people, and and so I think that inspiration is something that belongs to all of us, and we apply it in different mediums. So having said that, I agree. If that's the case, I don't think we know where it comes from either.
If we were to take Pushkin's notion that it won't be sought, it must itself find the poet, what do you do in the interim? And is there an interim? I mean, is each poem a sort of result of inspiration? Or is it just, practice along the way?
Yeah, I think that, you could say there are, this whole thing about inspiration and labor and perspiration and what have you, but, or was it luck favors the prepared mind, or what? I do think that one has to remain either anxious in their meditative silence or in their raucous existence, and then sort of as if you're sort of a hen waiting for your egg to hatch. Right. And then when it hatches, you don't really know why the egg hatched this second and not a minute later or a minute earlier. And that's how I think of inspiration. But I do think it is fed. You just don't know, sort of like Darwish said in a poem about dream. If you wait for a dream, it won't come. But you do have to construct the idea of the dream, and then you kind of play a mind game on yourself and just sort of forget about it, and then you still have to do some work, I think. Besides, it's easy for Pushkin to say whatever the hell he wants.
Well, I think the question that I imagined I would start with is that this notion that form is never more than an extension of content. Some poet said this via another poet. And what are your thoughts on the relationship of form and content? How might you amend or extend this idea or toss it? What do you say to poets and non-poets about this?
That form is an extension
of content.
So, I don't want to be starting all the time.
I'm still thinking.
Okay. I don't know if let me answer the question by telling you where I am in my moment of thinking about form and content. And I think that I have a very, these days I have very sort of maybe aggressive feelings against form. So speaking of Claudia Rankine's prose poem, so I think that I feel like we've reached a moment in sort of the modern age, at least in our part of the world, where the idea of form is sort of is a pendulum that swings between the archaic and the illusory. There is nothing without form. Anything that you utter, you speak, you give representation to, you place it in a form. I know you don't necessarily mean sort of classical, metered, or
I don't only mean
yeah.
that. And I don't think that poet did either.
Yeah, but so the idea of form, as in whether it's in couplets or whether it's prose, or I don't know. I feel like I'm at a moment where I think it's all sort of like an optical illusion, really, because in the end, so even again, just because we were talking about it, Claudia Rankine's prose poem. I didn't read it as prose. It was lyrical enough. I could have broken the lines. I could have made any kind of breath change with it, because I'm the one reading it. She's not saying this is the only way you can read it. And I don't think that I even read my own poems differently now, on the page, or I choose no punctuation or couplets, or and I read them differently with a different breath and pacing. So I'm not so sure anymore. So this is not a useful answer, maybe, but.
I think it is useful to sort of wonder about that, and it's interesting that you brought up Claudia Rankine, because I was also thinking about this sort of reinvention in her of what the lyric might be, or how the lyric may look to us. And it's a really kind of remarkable moment in that sense, which is why I asked, would you amend it? Would you toss it entirely?
Yeah, it's hard for me to know how to separate form and content. If I think of form as being in the way that you describe, everything having form, and syntactical structure, the way that the order of my words as a kind of form, it seems that thought, personality, history, moment are all poured into that kind of the gesture. And I think I keep hearing, and I don't know if this is useful, but I keep hearing and thinking about John Edgar Weideman's essay on silence. Does anybody remember the title of that? It might be On Silence. You can, if anybody's on JSTOR, you can find it if you look up John Edgar Weideman Silence. And he talks about his writing and his work, I should say, in the world being informed by the body's entire expressive repertoire. And he was a basketball player and a writer and a listener to the way people speak and family stories, and silence. And he talks about the silence as being part of the body's, whole expressive repertoire. So there's something too about that somehow, and I don't know how entirely to describe it, but that feels like an engagement, in so much as I am a body moving through the world, who has inherited languages and histories and has my own kind of way of speaking them, and imagining the ways that I'm read depending on where I am. In some way, I feel like that's what form and content are built out of, and it's hard when I think in that way to separate.
Your answer made me think of so recently neuropsychology or neuroscience sort of maps the area in the brain that lights up when you read poetry or listen to it to the area that listens to music, or also the area that activates when you are when one is experiencing reminiscence of loss and grief, or and at the same time, I'm just thinking that so form perhaps becomes important in the way that it has to be associated with sound. yet we struggle in a moment where we lose the orality of the art of poetry, and that it's muted, much more muted than it used to be, and we're just a reading public, quiet reading, like it's all novels and or prose. And so that's why I feel like the whole question of the form in poetry becomes a little suspect for me at this moment in my writing and thinking about it, because we really continue to push ourselves to not listen to the orality of poetry as much. Now, of course, you will say, but that's not true. So and so does it, and certain communities do it more and more. But I think overall, the orality of poetry is looked at as something regressive, something from a bardic age, and only few of us can pull it off, and it has to work on the page without the sound drama and so forth. And there is, I find that oppressive, and I find the machinery of thought behind it oppressive.
It's very interesting because both of you have essentially talked about the body.
Yeah, I hear you.
Both of you have talked about the body and the real importance of a kind of embodied experience, that even when you discussed inspiration, that idea of slicing the cucumbers and a line comes to you, or walking and something happens for you. And then, Fady, when you talk about this notion of the oracular, that somehow we have to have, or oral, that we have to have the voice and the body with that voice. This brings to mind, I was reading an interview, or not an interview, something that you wrote about bodies and constellations. And what's the relationship between bodies and constellations. And I guess, so I've been reading, I collected this quote that I'm not sure what to do with. And it's a Mahmoud Darwish quote. And it says, "I discovered that the earth was fragile and the sea light. I discovered that language and metaphor are not enough to provide a place for the place. The geographical part of history is stronger than the historical part of history. Unable to find my place on earth, I try to find it in history." With that in mind, and I guess, how might each of you speak to and about the histories and geographies, the constellations of your work?
I mean, in the piece, thank you for reading it, the response, the piece where I mentioned the constellations, I'm responding to a question about, process and priorities, or the heart of the work, whenever it was that I wrote it. And I was thinking about constellations, just thinking of a single body and how we're losing pieces of ourselves all the time, like fingernails and hair, and thinking in that kind of really clear way. But then also, of course, thinking of place, and having grown up in California with parents who grew up in places that were far from California, thinking of that kind of the distances that are built into a person. And so when I think of the constellations of the work, I think that the first thing I come to is really geographical space, and thinking of the ways, if I were to mark dots, on a map of the world, the various trajectories that I've, of mine and parents, grandparents, but also really interested in the ways that constellations are read. This is the bear, this is the this, and how strange and somewhat arbitrary, the namings of them are. I shouldn't say arbitrary, but interpreted. I mean, you could interpret them a million ways. And so I'm also interested in the ways that I think of, that I've been taught to interpret those distances, and really wanting to push myself to, you know, the story that, what people say about poetry all the time, poetry should make the familiar strange and make what is strange more familiar. But there's the work of poetry for me, and what the poems are often doing is they're often trying to push myself to read the story or read the constellation in a very different way, and to think about what's on the periphery. What are my tendencies in terms of this? What do I tend to see, and how do I push myself to really challenge those narratives? So in a way, I'm also interested in the constellation as a kind of narrative that you could reimagine, you know.
I think for me, you know, I've just recently found myself on the sort of the spectrum between the world body and the word body. And maybe in part it's a function of my relationship as a physician with the body. It just became too damn daily and intense in sort of the witness or presence with the body. That, and also as someone, as you say, who grows with time toward loss. You know, our sense of our bodies differ when you have kids, or when you knees start hurting, or your sense of desire changes. And so it is perhaps for me, going back to the Darwish quote, moving the geographical into a historical sense, but not in the way we tend to think of history as a political event, but in the way we tend to think of history as a function of time. And so I think that all poetry is a conversation with starlight, with you know, that which illuminates the present, which is the past, and it is a conversation with time, which in you know, to a large extent is a human construct, is not this absolute thing scientifically. We have to give it form. Speaking of form. And I think that if you go back to sort of the Darwish comment again, or his body of work, you will see that, you know, for instance, later on in his work, he has a wonderful poem called "Don't Write History as Poetry." And he also has a wonderful line in another poem called "I Didn't Apologize to the Well because it's the well of his childhood that he's lost forever from the geographical place." But in the poem, one of my favorite lines is "I broke myth and I broke." So what he did with history, because he had found himself arriving at this negotiation moment, is he took history to the point of deconstruction. He took it as far back as to make everything seem to be myth. And then when he sort of, he speaks about this actually, sort of an inspirational simultaneity with Walcott's Odysseus, and then Darwish wrote 2 large volumes based on sort of a historical, putting time into the context of history and then taking it back into myth, and then after that he was done with that. So history for him became something completely different. So he went further in that, you know, after that stage, into history as the idea of the annihilation of the self, not necessarily, you know, sort of from a mystical standpoint, which is also a function of time, obviously. So.
How has that influenced your own work? Because I noticed in Atlas, even when you refer to the tyrant, when you refer to these become figures that are not necessarily historical, but are mythical in the telling of a poem. And so, how would you kind of locate the the movement in Darwish to yourself, your thinking about history, your own?
I mean, I guess you could say there's a phase where he called it, so sort of when he came out of his younger days, he reached a moment where he called his work Palestine as metaphor. So Palestine became as a metaphor for the human condition. And in our contemporary time, so that the narrow historical idea of what Palestine is as a geographical construct became for him a metaphor for a different conversation with time. But then he was done with that, and then he moved into exile as metaphor, and then the self and the other. So it went back to the whole idea of the stranger. So Mahmoud Darwish is really, in that sense, obviously, it's been done in the history of mankind. Was always in conversation with the stranger, with the other, because without it, there is no self, right? It really, there would be an annihilation, but not the good kind. So for me, to be more direct, what I've sort of immediately absorbed from that and from my own personal experience, what was the problem of naming, which is sort of a paradoxical problem for me. To be blunt, I'll just say this: if I named certain things in that poem or in that book or in the second book, my understanding is that we are programmed to read for data, specific data that provides a mental convenience for us to say, oh, this is about that place and those people, and there is no paradigm to be drawn from. And so, now I'm not saying that avoiding the naming doesn't have its problems, but that was my notion. And there is a poem in the first book called "The Name of the Place," which I don't think it names a place, but and I think for me it was about that. And when I begin to do that in the work, I realize that I am having also a different conversation with time. Yeah, and it seems to work sometimes.
Aracelis, what about you in the historical? You, in one interview, louder, in one interview talked about feeling responsible for the histories of real people and real places. And what was the quote? Many of my poems are steeped in the history of real people and places. It is difficult to know how to cull and grow while being respectful of other people's stories, lives, bodies.
Well, I've been carrying Nikki Finney's. I'm carrying it now because it's been on my mind, but I've been carrying her Head Off and Split again. And specifically, there's one poem called Liberty Street Seafood, which takes place at the seafood shop, and there are three young black men behind the counter, and the speaker's in line making this order for the fish, and they've got they're cutting the fish up or scaling the fish, whatever your order is, and the three men have like the sparkles of the scales on their arms. And she does this amazing, I've been carrying this book and this poem because I've been thinking a lot about how she is talking about this moment and also the history behind, the history of the moment, the history behind the moment, the history of these bodies and the white fishmonger and the three black fish cutters. And she's talking about brutality and the brutalization of black bodies by white supremacist police, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she does so without further brutalizing the black bodies in the poem. And she does this in this poem, I think, by showing us the fish and the fish stand in as a kind of proxy. And she sets up this relationship between the fish and the boys, but the boys get to live, the boys get to dance. The boys are in danger, but the fish are the ones who are being killed. And I've been thinking so much, and I think part of that struggle that I'm describing is that I've been thinking about responsibility. I think about responsibility and what it means to talk about violence, and to be thinking about violence and joy and laughter. But when thinking about violence, how, again, what I said earlier, how not to keep that violence in perpetuity, in the poem that goes on and on and on and on, if anybody picks it up. And I struggle with it. And the latest thing that I've been thinking, that I've been asking myself to do, is to go through all the poems and of my own, and to slowly catalog the verbs that I assign to black bodies, female bodies, male bodies, white bodies, and just to compare, to kind of see again what the tendencies are, and then to look at the poets who I love, or the art pieces that I love. There's this great piece by these young turf dancers in Oakland called Turf Fiends. Does anybody know their work? Brilliant, amazing, and they have this piece, if you look it up on YouTube, called R.I.P., Rest in Peace, Oscar Grant. And they're actually, turf dancing is all about space and dancing in this cityscape. And a lot of the movements look like they're informed by technology, like the fast forward and the slow down, but also using the space that you're dancing in and interacting with space. And so they actually go to Fruitvale Station, and they're dancing in this station, and they're all these young black and brown boys dancing in the station. And it was so moving because, to me, it's obviously a memorial. It's a memorial, but the bodies, and if you think of time, and I'm fascinated by physics, and I don't understand. I can't wrap my mind around things, but like this illusion of time and the idea of timelessness, or all things happening at once. In a way, they're companioning him, but they're dancing, and it's beautiful. And there's something about that I'm trying to figure out how to do that. How to do that in a poem where you're not taking away from the history and the real, if it's dealing with violence, and if it's still, but you're also showing something more full than only that, and I'm struggling.
I think both of you are doing that. And I think there's this line, yours is the sweetness that survives the slaughter. And in each of your works, what I find is this sense of beauty that exists beside the slaughter. And it's both beauty and love. And I'm reminded there's that moment it happens several times in Beloved, where Morrison writes about the trees, and Zaqtan not being able to forgive herself for remembering their beauty, but not the boys. And what's interesting to me is that in your work, you kind of hold both of those things together, so that there's something formally that happens in that first book that is beautiful, at the same time that it's incredibly painful, and there's a terror in the content. And that this is also the case in your work, that there is love that survives the slaughter. I was going to ask you guys about that, and
I mean, regarding terror and sweetness, one of the difficulties I still have with some of the writing on being a physician or being a humanitarian physician, or having been, is the idea of the turning someone else's suffering into a spectacle, a beauty, Right, so we have a museum of suffering, which also the poetry world engages in, and we've now reached a moment in the poetry world where you if you pull off an anthropologic research project by doing something about some particular American figure in the old past, and you bring them into verse, or you go get a scholarship and you go to Tunisia or to Brazil and you study some people or some event and you put it in. I find that bizarre personally, but it's the moment of the moment of the marriage, the current marriage between power and knowledge that exists. And I don't want to dismiss it as something completely horrible and bad and people are, but I think it's a fad. It's intellectual fad.
How does your own work avoid that, though? And there's a moment when you talk about the sensational and the moralistic, right? And that there's something that somehow this poetry creates, manifests, makes possible, that doesn't result in the sensationalistic journalism that is about sort of holding up other people's suffering for viewing.
I honestly don't know anymore. I used to think I had more immediate answers for this, but I don't know anymore because I think maybe it is because I try my best to make sure that I am a complicit witness. And so is my reader. So I have to push back against the idea of saying, wow, he's really cool, this guy, one of us, and he's such a cool humanitarian or whatever, or, So I am aware also the idea, I have a problem with witness, right? Because to hold witness often is held by the powerful over those who are far less fortunate. And just because I'm Palestinian or because you're black or whatever doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have that conundrum. And so I if what you say is true, that my poems survive that somehow, away from the sensationalist, maybe it's because I sweat bullets over not coming across as someone who saves anything. I don't know.
That makes me think of Maud Martha, Gwendolyn Brooks's Maud Martha, and the way that she points and makes fun. I'm thinking of there's this one section where where Maud Martha is fixing a chicken in the kitchen, and the way that Brooks in that piece is showing somehow her own, there's the speaker's subject position, but also there's a kind of play with Brooks's own subject position and the fact that it's changing throughout, which has been, in undergrad I studied documentary studies, which, and that was the direction I thought I would go in and then didn't. But one of the things I always struggled with was how do you point to, the frame, the pushing against the kind of objective frame that we all know to push against, but sometimes it's easy to get lost and to forget that there's a frame around it. And so how to kind of poke holes and I'm not being, I don't think I'm doing what I hope to do yet. But I think part of the practice might be to figure out ways to kind of puncture whatever safety I'm moving through the poem with, and or to kind of show that question, what am I risking in writing this poem? What am I discovering? But also, how do I point to the writtenness of it, which feels, or the construction of it, which feels right now like a new question for me that I hadn't been asking before. Yeah.
I see it in the first book. I also see it in the second book. So it's interesting, and I don't think it's resolved, but I don't know that it can be resolved. Part of the sort of painfulness of the works is in that tension between this existence of beauty, and beauty is a certain kind of life, livingness, in the middle of suffering. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right that it can be resolved, and I like what you said earlier. Maybe that sort of provides a different articulation for the answer about sort of scanning your verbs, because I think one way that I try to push against this problem of the sensationalist or the moralistic or so forth is to try as best as I can to understand the contemporary and also the history of that language. You know, how do we, how has mankind performed the act of the spectacle, of the moralistic, of the scandalous, and the righteousness and so forth, so that when I want to write, am I not aware, for example, that when I spent days as a physician in refugee camps in Darfur or in Zambia not for Zambians, but for Angolans and Rwandans and what have you. Am I not aware that this is also the problem of representation of, say, Africans, right? This is, so all I'm doing is best intentions aside, is I'm augmenting, cementing the notion that that all these other people are just about, you know, the best you can say, oh, it's just, oh, they're so sad, so horrible over there. And am I not aware when I am writing this that I am, my alibi is that I am a Palestinian, because it's the same language that is used about me, not necessarily against me, but that too. And then, of course, now we know that this language has been extended to the whole Arab and Muslim and so forth. So I think that awareness is also, it helps. You know, you cannot sort of approach it with a sentimentality of just ignoring the history of thought and language in addressing these things.
Yeah, and that grammar reflects a structure of feeling.
Sure. Maybe that
And
goes
of
back to your question
understanding.
about form. So, and you mentioned syntax in the discussion of form.
This is wonderful. I could keep asking questions, but I think I'm supposed to open it to the floor. So if you have questions, please come up to the mic.
Or speak in a loud voice.
Or speak in a loud voice.
J.R.R. Tolkien, of Hobbit fame, once said that the worst thing that ever happened to poetry was the printing press. And going back to the question about form, is poetry really part of form? If you look at it from a point of view of it being a hearing, as opposed to the parallel sense of seeing, or so, you know, it would just be interesting. I don't have a specific question other than sort of getting feedback as to whether form is it a minor part of the writing of verse, or does form begin to take on the major lead portion of it? And when we as writers go through the process of writing verse, do we do it from the Tolkien perspective, or do we do it from a more formalistic perspective? And my own view is that the content does drive it, which suggests that it's more of the hearing aspect as opposed to the seeing aspect of it. But I just would like to get a little response to that.
I mean, I think right away of the difference between listening, being at a reading, or sitting, you know, being at the house and listening to a recording of somebody reading without, or reciting a poem without seeing it in front of me, especially poems that I've not heard before. And I can't tell because my listening is so informed by reading. But I know that there are moments when an image when that listening turns into seeing, whether it's seeing or imagining a kind of space or gap, or rest or silence, or an image. And when I recall what I've heard, there are moments, I'm thinking of Jerry Stern's poem, The Dancing. There are moments when I can hear the way that it's constructed, and that has everything to do, and I keep returning to syntax because I'm alive to the ways that, whether you're listening or reading, that structure that determines your kind of relationship to the poem. And so there's a way that the listening, how do I say, the listening is utterly informed by silence and speed and pace. And so again, that's another way of thinking about form that I think can show itself on a page, but then when it's page-based and when I'm paying attention to, Nikki Finney's poems say, there's a relationship I have to it even before coming to the words and knowing what the words are, but just what that white space is doing or not doing, what I imagine, what I'm getting ready for myself, what I'm getting ready to experience or hear, depending on whether it's flooded with text or light. And I also think a lot about page as image, which I think you can think of sound as image, but page as image, and the shapes of things as a kind of engagement with text, but also with the shape of things. That's a very muddled. Those are the things that come to mind.
I imagine that you're sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, you're asking about the regression of poetry from the public sphere, in the sense that poetry was oral and, anthropologically oral for the purpose of documentation of an oral history of a people and of their sense of emotions and moral codes and tribal ethics and what have you. And even when it became courtly, Roman Empire, Islamic Empire, or what have you, it still served a purpose for the documentation of the state, so to speak. And I think that in the modern age, this is no longer the case. And there is and I think that for me, when I hear the questions about form and content and orality and sound and so forth, Walcott writes in form, but you can't memorize his poems because they're, for the most part, they're long as hell. But I think that there's a wonderful essay that Walter Benjamin brought back to life by a German romanticist by the name of Walkman, or Joachman, Joachman, called The Regression of Poetry. And Walter Benjamin sort of introduces it, and it's his introduction to the essay and analysis of it, annotation of it, is longer than the essay itself. And they're both wonderful to read together because Joachman says that progress, human progress, is the reason for the regression of poetry from its ancient function. Even if you go back to, the function described in Cienza Nuevo, in Vico's, function of language and stages of language development and so forth. Yet Joachman says that because there's been so much human progress, poetry no longer serves the purpose, right, that it used to emotionally. We get now what we get from poetry, what we used to get from poetry. We get much of it from visual domains, at least. And even that has pushed the story, There's no Dickens anymore, Nobody's waiting with bated breath to read his chapters in his, his Pickwickian papers or what have you. So yet, having said that, Jokman it's really a piece worth reading, and again, and Benjamin's introduction of it. And so in the end, unfortunately, Jokman says, but I still don't believe that there is enough human progress because we're such, we still live our moments of barbarity, despite all this sort of pseudoscientific dance that we do, or that even if it is scientific, it's really not expressive of true progress. That this is why poetry is still alive and necessary, although it is no longer capable of sustaining itself the way it used to because its function is no longer needed. And in being so, he says, that's a good thing. So it's a strange way, and I'd written about this briefly in an essay. Let us say that the death of poetry would be a great day for mankind. You know, that's how I think of all this conversation about orality and form and memorization. But
Because we've progressed. Can you say more?
we would have, because we would have progressed to where we would have no need. We would, as Jokman says, we would live in triumphalist joy, and you would, and I just said at the beginning, neuropsychology or neuroscience tells us we've mapped the brain. It activates brain parts of the brain about loss and grief and da-da-da-da and so forth. Well, if you, so it would be a good day. But anyway, so it's obviously an endless conversation, but.
Yes, on this thing, you mentioned in this play with time, that there's kind of like an ascension, there is like an evolutionary process. And I was wondering if you see that evolutionary process going to oblivion, like zero, which would mean, also you talk about the end of poetry, would that mean that we reach zero, or is it an ascension towards, like a helical ascension, like towards infinity? Kind of, which way would you see the ascension going?
I don't know if I see it going, but I hope that it is a sort of an ascension toward an infinity as opposed to sort of oblivion. But I'm very interested in the way in the expressions that you use, right? You use sort of oblivion, ascension, helical, and it goes back in my mind to something I'd brought earlier about the necessity of poetry always having a conversation about self and other, or self and stranger. And once you, and there's no one without the other, and once you either merge the two, which annihilates the idea of the boundary, that the I is so holy that I must kill you, for me to become me, as opposed to I only become holy if we vanish together. Which is a mystical state, which we long for it because very few of our kind, very few humans have reached that mystical state, and we call them Sufis, saints, whatever you want to call them, shamans, and I think in that sense I would think it's a transcendent vanishing or a transcendent conversation with time. I would also, I like the word helical, right? Because of the double helix and the DNA part of it. That there's this problem. It's almost a conundrum. We can't solve it with reproduction. There is no life if you don't do it, right? So I cannot see it move toward oblivion because we would be extinct. So that helical has to function just like the double helix does towards reproduction.
And in order for reproduction to happen, there has to be a certain kind of diversity. So I almost wonder about the sort of consent to be multiple selves, rather than a kind of one self, but many selves, and that becomes a space where maybe poetry isn't necessary as well, when we can consent to be multiple selves. Yeah.
Fady, am I asking a question now? I don't know if anyone else is. In writing textu and using a structure of 160 characters, I'm wondering what you learned about language and about your own kind of linguistic creative process. What shifted for you in working that way, if anything?
Something did definitely shift. I'm not so sure I know yet how to articulate it. But something did shift. It was a sort of a, I mean, I want to escape the answer and say it's the art of the short poem, and I don't know how to summarize the art of the short poem, which is quite diverse in art, whether it's the haiku or whether it's, entries from the cell like Yanis Ritsos is just writing on a little scrap of paper, or Emily Dickinson, but it is some sort of a relationship with language about cumulative effect. How does how does one really concentrate much of? How do you activate that part of the brain? Because this is really what interests me about the textu, the writing on a cell phone. We constantly activate each other by sending each other texts. And the way we respond to it becomes a very habitual response. If you just met a new interest, friendship, lover, whatever, you respond differently in the texts than you would when your brother texts, or if you're married, your spouse, or or an old friend, or the language is different. And if you follow yourself, you maintain a different set of language usage with each one, which means that we already habituate ourselves and each other to certain linguistic responses. And so I wanted to live that experience and see what happens, to the ideas that I had in mind about how do I activate my own brain, and how does the world, the ideas that I receive activate my own brain. And it resulted in multiple dictions, actually. So a friend of mine very generously said that it reminded him of Shakespeare's sonnets, but that's a little far-fetched.
Thank you. I had a question. Do you have any more thoughts on Maud Martha in terms of her subjectivity versus being this object or a wallflower from your own work, your own documentary work, or your own poetry or historical interest?
I mean, what strikes me, I'm thinking of Maud Martha, I'm thinking of Annie Allen, I'm thinking of the Aeneid, and I'm thinking of one of the things that I love so much about Brooks's work is this kind of way, and this is what I strive to do, but this way of bringing into your own, bringing into the center what might have been your own periphery, or your own peripheries, which are maybe your centers, but other people's peripheries, giving that space to think and talk, and a kind of, I don't know, I never met Gwendolyn Brooks, but this over and over again in Maud Martha, that sense of irresolution, and something that you said earlier about the struggle, maybe this can't be, thinking about representation, beauty and sweetness and slaughter, and maybe it can't be resolved. Which I agree with, but showing that tense space, a space built out of tension and struggle, which I think Brooks does over and over again in her work. I'm thinking of the Soldier Sonnets. And does so with this glorious language that feels like Gwendolynian, but also specific to the characters at hand or to the project at hand. So like Maud Martha versus the Aeneid, there's a different kind of density in the Aeneid, and with Maud Martha, we've got those these little prose sections, which also reminds you of like these slices. This is not the whole of everything. I'm pointing to the gaps and the leap spaces, which I hadn't thought of before, but now thinking about that, the leaps that she takes from chapter to chapter, section to section, might be a way of pointing to what's missing, you know. Not all of it is here, which I think is a thing for me to carry into the questions I'm asking about my own work, how to point to those gaps, you know.
I think we have time for one more question. Thank you for coming.